Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining this learning experience brought to you by WireMock. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. Before we dive into today's session, I have just a couple of notes to review with everyone. First of all, we are recording our session today. So if you miss any of our conversation, if you'd like to watch again later, or if you'd like to share this with the rest of your team, we'll be sure to send you an email with access to the on-demand recording shortly after we conclude this live session today. Now, if you'd like to get involved, there are a couple of ways to do so. Your first option is to use the chat tab on the right side of your screen. And when you find that chat tab, I'd like you to let us know from where in the world you're joining from today. Now, if you have specific questions, we do want you to send those into the Q&A box. Sending your questions to the Q&A just helps us keep track of all of them, and we have some time set aside at the end of our program to address those questions. So please do send them in as you have them, and we'll do our best. Additionally, we have a poll that will launch, it looks like right after slide number 7, so keep an eye out for that poll as it will pop up. And if you are interested in checking out any additional resources, we have a couple there for you in the handout section. So let me go ahead and press share on those. They should be popping up on your UI here in just a second. Finally, we will be selecting 2 of our most engaged attendees to win a $50 Amazon gift card. So ways to become eligible for this giveaway are to send in your chats and questions, but you can also fill out our survey that is linked in the handouts, as well as I'll pin it to the top of the chat toward the end of our program. So let's dive right in. Today we'll be discussing transforming developer productivity in an API-dependent environment. I'm joined today by Yuri Maus, CEO and co-founder at WireMock. And we also have Yusuf Khan, former CIO and CISO, is a partner at Ridge Ventures, and also an investor, board member, and advisor at Ridge Ventures. So Yusuf and Yuri, thank you both so much for joining us today on Techstrong Learning. Yuri, would you like to dive us right in today?
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. We will, in terms of the agenda, we will start with a short introduction of Yusuf and myself. Then we will talk about developer productivity a bit and the importance of developer productivity in general. We will then dive to the impact of API-dependent environment on developer productivity, the solution that we see for that with WireMock. We'll talk about a few challenges and the solution, and then we'll finish up with a short demo of the system and Q&A. But we'll start with a short introduction, and Yusuf will be glad if you can start.
Well, thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining from all over the world. Wow. I'm Yusuf Khan. I'm a general partner at Ridge Ventures. We're an early stage VC firm, a proud investor in many great companies, including WireMock. My background, I've been a chief information officer and a chief information security officer of several companies. I was the first CIO for companies like Qualys and Pure Storage, as well as MoveWorks and Automation Anywhere. I've been the early advisor to several companies. Most notable of those are companies like Zoom and Mist Systems, which was acquired by Juniper Networks, and other companies like Orcus and Pulse, as well as Level Technologies. So really excited to dive in. I've managed technical teams. I've suffered the pain points of managing large technical infrastructure, and so looking forward to sharing some of those insights, as well as really excited to hear more about what WireMock has done to be able to transform developer productivity.
Thank you, Yusuf. I appreciate you joining us today. A bit about myself. We'll not go through everything here, but just to give the context. So my background is in engineering. I was engineer and then engineering manager for quite a few years. Then I moved to product management and managed a few teams. And then I actually, like I like to say, I crossed the line to the dark side and moved to sales, and was joining startup in very early stage and building an entire sales organization for the company. And 2 years ago, I met Tom, who is my partner today, and we founded WireMock, which optimized developer productivity in an API-dependent environment. Tom was already working on Wiremark open source for quite a few years, and we decided to join forces and release a commercial edition on top of that, and push and really solve this problem in a great way, because we see a great challenge, and we see a lot of challenges that we can solve in a great way with Wiremark. So after the introduction, I'm sure that everyone on this call is familiar with developer productivity and how important it is to optimize developers' time and improve developer productivity. But just to kind of set the context, we want to take a look on survey from Iconic Growth, which was done with 200 engineering leaders, and talking about various engineering predictions for 2024. And we see that there is very high priority for the mandate of developer productivity, and how engineering leaders are pressured to do more with limited resources, and understanding and tracking developer productivity will really be essential in 2024. Another interesting thing that we found is this Gartner survey that was done around the purchasing priorities, and we see that developer productivity and the need for developer productivity is one of the highest motivation when leaders are purchasing new software. So Yusuf, we'll be glad to ask you the first question. You manage the technical teams, and seeing that, it will be great to hear from you. Why do you think the developer productivity gets such a high importance, and how did you see developer productivity importance when you were running technical teams?
Yeah, well, look, it's important to set that as a context, and I think most people don't appreciate the depth and the complexity and probably the impact if you don't really look to solve for it. So focusing on improving developer productivity and transforming it for the longer term is a big business benefit for the company. It's not just really good for the engineering function or it's good for developers. It's good business practice. The reason for that is that every enterprise and every company is ultimately becoming a technology company. And what that basically means is that they are building more software, they're buying more software, they're managing more technology in general. And as a result of that, you're effectively hiring more technical people. Somewhere down the line, being able to do that efficiently has to become a major priority for the company versus just the VP of engineering or the VP of DevOps saying, oh, we should basically be improving developer productivity. And the reason for that is very simple. Each of the companies and the industries that these companies compete in are being transformed by software. They're not being transformed in any other way. It's about bringing in great digital experience. So in the past, it was an operational function of being able to put in internal solutions that basically managed in the enterprise. Now it's much closer to the customer. So customer experience and developer productivity are intrinsically linked, and companies have woken up to that. And so as a result of that, and one of the things that I had realized as a CIO of several companies was being able to make sure that as we were building our software stack for operational aspects, but also in terms of customer experience, we had to optimize for being able to constantly make sure that the quality of the product that we were deploying to our customers was very high in the experience. And that was, something which was now a recurring problem. You end up, constantly having release cycles and being able to optimize the product and the experience, and you'd be constantly either doing mergers and acquisitions and bring those products into a single experience, or you'd be improving or be able to basically integrate. So that is a constant challenge. Not enough companies have focused on that, and it's definitively linked to how they are performed and how they are perceived with their customers. And I don't think enough companies are actually connected dots. So super important topic for enterprises. And the business impact can be substantial.
Cool. Thank you. And yeah, we indeed see that the larger the company is, then the importance of developer productivity become higher. So talking about developer productivity in general, we will now dive a bit more to the API aspect. So before talking about the challenges that we see with API dependency, we want to talk about the fact that the new normal is API driven. API is everywhere. And I'm sure I'm not renewing anything to people that are joining this call, but just to look on some interesting numbers from various surveys. So we see a survey here talking about the fact that over 90% of developers use APIs. I assume it's actually more around 100%. A lot of dependency or usage of third-party APIs, meaning developers that are using and utilizing the third-party APIs. All the adoption of microservices architecture increased the API usage even more, because with microservices architecture, you have now a lot of components that interacting between themselves using APIs. And of course, we cannot have a session without saying the word AI. So we see that even the use of OpenAI, eventually it's an API, and we see skyrocket growth of OpenAI API and other APIs like that, that really pushing the usage of API even more. And Yusuf, will be curious to hear for you, like, do you resonate with this statement as the new normal is API driven? And how did you see like kind of the API usage when you were running your teams?
So couldn't agree more. I mean, ultimately, API is now currency for software, right? I mean, that's ultimate. It is the currency for actual business transformation. And the reason for that, as I alluded to the earlier point, is where you have environments which are more driven by being able to build as well as deploy more software. A couple of key things happen. In order for them to be able to operate really well as a business, they need to have great business architecture. And that's going to be driven by API. It's not going to be driven by anything else. And so ultimately, it comes into the new normal. The second aspect is it goes back to the original point about talking about customer experience. You do not, if you think about the experience that you would have with your mobile app or basically a web app, the more interconnected you have, not just with your own applications, but the partnerships, and whether it's, going from one, application into the other for, say, a transaction process, that has to be seamless. Customer experiences are exceptionally unforgiving right now, right? And I think that is the new normal, and to be able to make those successful, APIs at the center of it. When I was a CIO, this was one of the challenges that we constantly had, and part of that was really about, and I really wish Wiremark was there back in the day, but it wasn't. It was this constant challenge of being able to bring in more software into the enterprise, whether that was basically bought by SaaS, as well as basically building our own applications, and then being able to have a degree of interconnectedness across them. It sounds simple at the high level. It initially did, but it's become really complex, and it's become an overhead for a lot of companies. And as a result of that, has hindered productivity. So definitively, it now kind of becoming a central part of the conversation. It's actually one of the key things that people will ask. Like in the past, when you had conversations with software vendors, or when you were building something, you would ask the question, well, tell me a little bit about your company, and tell me about what makes well, and you'd be able to go through the demo. Now the question on top of mind when you're even assessing a vendor is like, okay, well, how do you integrate well into my architecture? What does your API structure look like? That is a language that is being spoken at not just at the developer or the engineering manager level. It's being spoken at the C level, no question.
Yeah, and this actually, like everything you said, is connecting also very nicely to one thing that we didn't mention here about that the fact that organization, 80%, I like this from a Gartner survey, that talking about the fact that 80% of organization provide or are planning to provide publicly exposed API, which is up from 46% in 2019, which means that everything is interconnected, and companies need to externalize their APIs, and we will see also the impact on that, on API experience and developer productivity with Wiremark. Great. So we'll go to the next step. So life is good, and API is everywhere, and the developers has a lot of ways to build their application using the different kind of Lego pieces of the various APIs that they use. But then the challenge that we see is that the increased API dependency cause dev instability and slows delivery. So instead of actually improve developer productivity, in many cases we see that what happens is that this is actually degrading developer productivity. And why is that? And we will look on two aspects, one as the API consumer and the second as the API provider. So as an API consumer, we are talking about the developers that now need to consume a lot of APIs, external and internal API that will be integrated into their application. And if we are looking on the third-party APIs, a lot of times the developers will either not have access to the third-party API from the development environment, or the third-party API will charge them per API call, or number one complaint that we hear from our customer is that they work with a lot of different companies that deliver them sandbox as the way to integrate their API. But this sandbox is a sandbox and it's not stable. And imagine, first of all, that you need to connect with like 20 or 10 different sandbox, each sandbox with its own API key and own way to connect. And because it's a sandbox, it's not maintained in a good way. So every day a different sandbox will fail, and now you need to understand why your CI CD process failed and build process failed, and creating a lot of challenges to companies. We were talking, like kind of interesting example. One of our customers was mentioning that he was integrating with the sandbox, and the sandbox is available only between 8 to 5 and not available on the weekend. So every time they have challenges with that. Or another customer was talking about the fact that they need to populate data, but it takes 3 weeks to populate data, their own data to the sandbox. So a lot of challenges around that. And even if things are stable, this sandbox enable you to test only basic scenarios. You cannot do negative testing, you cannot do load tests with them, and so on. So we see tremendous challenges that we hear from all of our customers, and the very common pain that we hear from a lot of people that I speak with. Then the second challenge that we are talking and seeing is parallel development with API dependencies is slow. And here I always like to give an example. Let's say you have a mobile app team and you have a backend team, and now the mobile app want to add like a new functionality to the mobile app, but it depending on a new API or maybe various new APIs. So they sit in a room, they decide on the API that they will have, but the API is not ready yet. So now the mobile team is sitting and waiting for the backend team, or maybe they try to develop in parallel and things are not stable and things are changing. And now the mobile team is kind of keep getting changes. So a lot of challenges around that. And again, to give an example, one of our customer, Jumia, which is an e-commerce, had a lot of challenges around that, tried to put the mobile team together, sitting together with the backend team, try to define processes, but nothing helped. And also the feedback cycles in these cases is very, very long, because at the end of the day, the backend team will deliver the API, the front-end team will get the API after a few weeks. Maybe now there are challenges, so the entire cycle is really not optimized and degrading developer productivity. And before talking about the problem with the API provider, Yusuf will be glad to hear from you. How do you resonate with these challenges? Did you face them when you were running the technical teams?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think quite a few of those, but I think I want to emphasize on a number which kind of always comes into place. Like, there's always going to be challenges with APIs, and it's really about how which ones basically start to become more priority. And I think one of the key things that definitely people who are listening in need to kind of take away is to think about kind of your stack and think about where you need to be able to prioritize the effort. So, of course, the obvious ones which come into place are going to be about performance and scalability. That's kind of where the conversation typically starts. But the problems have now evolved definitively on the security side, and how you're able to basically be a target for security breaches like that. That is completely critical. And so being able to spend time thinking about that, these problems start to grow. The thing that kind of is under spoken about, and actually which becomes a much bigger problem as your architecture improves, is really about just error handling. So being able to just do, providing meaningful way of being able to do that with, kind of just basic fundamentals is kind of really important. The other thing that most people don't realize is, with the volume, you've really got to think about how you think about performance, how you think about data formatting, all of the interoperability issues that typically go into place. And the last thing is that, we talked about this in the past, Yuri, like, no one is coming out of either colleges or otherwise saying, I can't wait to monitor and maintain APIs. Like that's not, you know, like it's you know what I mean? Like, so we have a talent acquisition, a talent development problem. And in the end, having managed operational teams, as much as a nice person as I can be, as some people would who work for me would hopefully validate, the reality is there's a bunch of the jobs that they do not, you know, they don't appreciate, right? And so if you have the right, you know, the right architecture in place, the way you're able to basically build and be able to actually think about the dependency that your business has on APIs, it actually impacts people's work. And I think that's the thing that is usually not spoken about enough, is that the actual impact of it. And so that is one of those problems that continue. There's going to be a whole host of challenges, and each of these resonate with what I've gone into, and they're going to. So I think the takeaway that I think people would take place is, how do you be honest with yourself about some of these issues, and how do you basically prioritize and be able to solve for them?
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned a few times performance and load test. So yeah, like this is also something that we see quite often with customers, because imagine that you want to run an end-to-end testing of your application, performance testing, and you have a dependency on a payment gateway. How do you run that when you have that dependency? So yeah, definitely challenges that we hear.
And look, part of it, by the way, is part of the business context, right? I mean, if it's a a financial services company where you're doing transactions, that is unforgivable. But if you're basically doing an e-commerce, or you're adding into a car, that is sort of manageable. You're able to be okay with a little bit of latency, right? All of those things start to become problematic if you're not able to actually optimize your environment accordingly across each of those different vectors, from error handling to security to rate limiting, abuse prevention, data formatting. The list kind of goes on and on. That's a heavy workload that needs to put into place, and people need to think about their API strategy in a much more broader context.
Cool. So switching gears, so yeah, like we were talking about the API consumer. I'm the consumer of the API and the challenges that I have. But then we also see challenges for the API provider. Okay, so I am either designing an API or I'm providing an API. And challenges that we see in the API design, we talk with a lot of customers that were talking about the fact that API design process is cumbersome. And today there is all this API first approach, which is great. But then the challenge is that you have a slow theoretical API design process, because usually people will sit in a room and will maybe have writing some example on the board, and eventually finish the meeting with some document that they need to take and translate to the design and to the implementation. That can change over time, or they will use tools that will enable you to handwrite OpenAPI spec, which is challenging for non-technical people and challenging in general, even for technical people. And we are the customers that are talking about the fact that it creates a lot of challenges of collaborating and integrating between team members. So we see a lot of challenges in the API design process. And then the last part on onboarding, in delivering a great developer experience is hard. And we talked before about how companies want to externalize their API, and they want other companies or other partners to integrate with their APIs, and creating a great developer experience and onboarding experience is a challenging task. And not every company can do that. It requires a lot of resources. And if you don't do it well, it can create a lot of challenges. And yeah, we heard a lot of examples of companies that had a lot of complaints from their partners and customers about this experience. So cool. And Yusuf will be glad to hear like your take about kind of the API design part and the onboarding experiences we talked about. In parallel, we will also put a poll on the screen to just hear like which challenge do you resonate with.
Those are good choices for sure. I think there's a couple of key things that sort of go into place. I think, Yuri, just to clarify, your question was centered specifically around the design challenges. Is that fair?
Yeah, the design and developer experience, like either one,
Yeah.
will be glad to hear. Which one do you feel is an
It,
important?
here's the thing. I think the best systems are the ones which are centered around great customer experience. It sounds so basic, but the fact that there are literally companies that are focusing just on helping with API documentation, right? I,
Yeah,
the fact that we actually have people who are basically do that because it's lacking is astounding to me, right? That's part of the experience. Why would you basically want your engineers to be able to spending time doing research development because you haven't provided both the answers to obvious questions? So the best companies in the space, definitively you're in that, is you understand the pain point. Resonating with that is important. Then there are other basically kind of core fundamentals. Just the fact that you are able to have an API design first approach, right?
yeah,
Like there's engineering teams have thought about this as an afterthought. They have to actually have this at the center of the thinking. The reality is that any product that's being built, whether it's consumer or it's business to business or otherwise, ultimately needs to be an API design first approach. It has
yeah,
to be at the center of it. I'll give you tons of examples. If you think about Goldman Sachs, as much as it's been an investment bank for 100 plus years, is actually a financial management platform which has APIs into wealth advisors. Okay. The reality is, if you think about airlines, they're in the customer experience business. They want to be able to think about, really good check-in process and being able to do that seamlessly. They happen to fly planes as well, but they want to be able to optimize that through technology. And all of that is going to be done through high performance, good design, and being able to make sure that you have stability at the API level. Those things are super important. On the developer side, it just has to be, does it really fit in well with your CI/CD pipeline? Are you able to do the core of what you need to be able to do this? Whether it's automating the testing of it or being able to actually be able to do simulation like that, all of these things start to become heavy. I think the core point I want to make is that with every transformational shift in technology, especially when you have it, I think when companies woke up to the power of being able to have APIs and have good business architecture, they discovered that there was actually a lot more involved to be able to make this successful, right? It's actually a huge overhead. And it's not just about fixing stuff. It's actually, well, hey, there's a bunch of people who are dependent on your application and your APIs. It's not just your customers. Your customers are developers who are basically tapping into it. And so when they can't do good levels of regression testing, they don't have the good documentation, they're going to be like, well, that's actually one of the reasons I'm not going to be able to use this. Right? It actually is a definitive reason. You hear this in terms of feedback when you look to be able to deploy tools. When I was a CIO and a CISO and I was building coming solutions in place, I'd have pushback from some of the team. They said, well, the APIs really suck.
yeah.
The table structures don't work and the performance is basically all over the place. And you're like, I thought this was the best solution. It's a public company, it's doing super well. Yeah, it is, but it's kind of way behind. It hasn't transformed its stack, and that doesn't serve me very well. And I think people need to focus on it a lot more in terms of at the design level than before.
Cool. Yeah. Good notes. So these are the challenges, and in terms of the solution that we see to this challenge is a API developer productivity platform that improves efficiency with mock first solution, and we'll talk a bit about kind of the different solutions. So the idea with the mocking solution is to mock or virtualize the API that you depend on, and then create an isolated environment where you have full control on everything. So if we look on the challenges that we had before, how does this solve the challenges? So if you recall, we talked about the fact that you need to integrate with multiple third-party APIs or sandbox, and you don't have control on that. And the mocking basically will break dependency on the third-party API, because what it will do, it will enable you to mock all the APIs that you depended on, and then now you have full control on the request and response, and you can actually build the entire business cases that you need to test or to develop against. And the mocking platform that we bring with WireMock Cloud is a dynamic one. It enables you to return dynamic response. It enables you to take stuff from the request and put it in the response, to import data and so on. So we will see our customers building quite sophisticated business cases and developing and testing everything against that in isolation. Then if we go to the second part, mocks for internal APIs enable parallel development. So we talked about the problem, how do you parallelize the development between different teams? Okay, so if we go back to the example of the mobile team and the backend team, now what will happen is that they will sit in a room, they will define the API, and even though that the API doesn't exist yet, they will be able to generate the API, the mock, and the mobile team will work against the mock while the backend team is actually implementing the API, and that way they can save weeks of development. I mentioned Jumia before. They were able to solve this challenge using the mocking platform and WireMock. And it's also very easy to create mock. You can create mock either by using the UI or by import OpenAPI specification, or you can record traffic and the traffic will create the mock for you. So there are various ways to create, and people usually will be able to move very fast with creating the mocks. So this, the mocking platform will solve the challenges of the API consumer and will enable them to move much faster in the development process. Then if we go to the API provider, so if we go back to this challenge around API design, and we said that people sitting in a room and they design by example and they write in some example on the board, and or maybe they try to edit up an API spec. Basically what we said here, we are calling this solution Figma for API design. We were saying if people anyway are designing by example and writing example on the board, let WireMock be kind of the board and where they will write the examples, and the example will be the mocks, because the mocks represent the API and what request response match do you want to have and how do you want the API to behave. And the capabilities that we added in WireMock is actually the ability to generate open API spec from the mocks. So now you will have teams sitting in the room, put WireMock Cloud on the screen, and creating all the mocks very, very easily because it's easy to create the mocks. And the mocks will generate eventually the open API specification and the documentation portal so the team can keep in sync. And we see companies that are really improving collaboration and design processes with using this capability, and able to also enable better contract testing and make sure that things are not drifted between the design process and the implementation process. And if we'll have time, this is the part that we will show a quick demo at the end. And then talking about the developer experience and giving good developer experience to your customers, basically, we have an ability to embed mocks in your developer portal. And the mocks themselves, because they are so dynamic and it's easy to create them, first of all, it will be very easy to create the developer portal experience. And second, the consumer of the developer portal will have a very easy way to understand how to use the API, and from that migrate to the real API. And we have a quote from one of our customers who is a large bank, and for every API that they have in the developer portal, they have a mock written in WireMock that is some kind of a smart sandbox that enable easy onboarding. And we see mocking can improve every aspect of the software development lifecycle and really improve developer productivity in an API-dependent environment. So going to the next slide. So like I said, we've started to talk a bit about that, but WireMock, we position it today as the API developer productivity platform. We optimize developer productivity in an API-dependent environment, and really doing all of that using the mocking platform and embedding mocking in different aspects of the software development lifecycle in order to simplify complex processes. And I will talk like for 2 slides now about WireMock. So WireMock is an open source first. We are today the market leader for mocks. Developers love WireMock. You can see we have some quite nice numbers. The project itself is being used by 3,700 open source projects. We have 4.6 million monthly Java package downloads. The project can be consumed either by the Java package or you can pull a Docker image, so around 1 million monthly pulls of the Docker image. We have hundreds of contributors. We have a very active community in Slack. I invite people to join our Slack community. So, and we keep investing a lot in the open source because we really believe in delivering the value through the open source to the community and to customers. So the open source itself is a component that, like I said, you need to download, you need to develop it. And then on top of that, we deliver WireMo Cloud, which WireMo Cloud is the API developer productivity platform. And it's basically, if the open source, you need to download it, you need to install it, you need to write code or edit scripts. WireMo Cloud is much easier to use. It's hosted in the cloud. You also have we also have an on-premise of the solution. You have simple UI to create and manage mocks, unlimited scale, team management, all the enterprise readiness features. And like I mentioned, we also took mocking and we applied that to different aspects of the software development lifecycle. So we have modules like chaos engineering, where chaos engineering is the practice of how do you develop, how your app will behave when things will fail randomly. And we are doing that using mock in a very easy way. And this is something that we see a lot of customers pretty excited about, that because chaos engineering is something to become more popular, but the current tools today are very hard to operate and maintain. So WireMo give a very easy way to do that. API prototype, like I mentioned, the ability to prototype an API before designing it using mocking, and concurrent testing, which enable you to make sure that there is alignment between the producer and the consumer, and that mocks will not be drifted from the real API definition. So eventually, people that wants to start like a small project and so on, individuals can use the open source and can scale with that. But if you really want to impact your overall API developer productivity platform in the developer productivity in the company and improve parallel development and all of the stuff that we talked about, then WireMo Cloud is the solution for you. And we're also happy to have really good customers that love the product and they are getting a lot of value from the product, a lot of quotes from customers that are getting meaningful ROI from the product and able to improve productivity by parallelize the mobile and backend team development, or improve resiliency by running low tests without having to stretch real backend or third-party APIs that you don't have access to. Ability to collaborate, improve customer experience, like I mentioned, with the developer portal. And we really see API mocking as a force multiplier for your build, test, and release process. And we'll have one more slide, and after that, I will show a short demo. But Yusuf, maybe a question for you. You guys invested in WireMock. We'll be glad to hear from you, like what made you guys excited about WireMock.
Well, quite a few things. I think number one is, at this stage of investing, it's a lot about the team. I think yourself and Tom, startups are hard.
Yeah.
Building companies from the ground up, it's underreported the journey it takes to be able to build a company. I was an early advisor to several companies, which there were just sometimes it was only a few people, or definitely just a few dozen people, and it was hard then, even after you do financing others. So one is the team stood out. I think the second, that we built out a thesis of understanding kind of where companies and markets are heading towards. As I alluded to my earlier point, I think we have tons of relationship with CIOs. I've of course been one in multiple organizations, and we tend to focus on investing in companies which are solving core business problems, right? And to be honest with you, some of these problems are more fundamental and basic. They come on the back of a major shift in technology. Being able to sort of put that in place, and so being able to solve that problem and actually being able to impact both the productivity of people and the uplift and uplifting productivity, that came across. The number third thing is, we discovered, and we did quite a bit of work of actually understanding what people have been using. And to be honest with you, they weren't very happy. Customer happiness is is something that people just take for granted. Being able to actually solve a problem and be rigorously focused towards solving that problem is something that the Wiremark team had built. And I think the fourth is followership. It's unspoken. The developer community and the engineering community are ones which are able to do, clever individuals who are able to do their own research, be able to do the testing, be able to understand the experience, and to make independent decisions. There was a substantial amount of followership that you and Tom and the team have basically been able to build a brand around that, which is focused on specific problems. And now you've been expanding that platform from when we first invested. So that I could go on, Yuri, but I think you're pretty humble, and Tom's pretty down to earth as well. But I wanted to make sure I keep it on the level and give you the credit that is due.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Last slide, and then we'll go to the demo. So we talked a lot about developer productivity, but one thing that there are a lot of articles about that, how do you measure developer productivity? So specifically for Wiremark, we developed an ROI calculator that enable you to, the customer is filling like various details, and eventually we'll get this outcome that is talking about various KPIs, like what is the velocity gain, like how many hours you will be able to save, what is the infrastructure cost save, because we talk with a lot of customers that are actually operating testing environment and trying to load the environment internally in order to deal with that. So we are able to save them a lot of money. Obviously, dev cost optimize because of all the optimization that we run. Developers can be much more optimized, and they can do quite a lot more. And so on. We were talking with customers that are talking about bug reduction because they are able to test much better, so they are able to reduce bug detection and so on in production. So yeah, like we see quite a lot of quantified ROI that our customers are talking with us about. But Yusuf will be curious to hear from you. What other KPIs would you use in order to test or to measure developer productivity?
How about developer happiness?
Yeah,
it sounds crazy, but nobody wants to use a product that it's going to be problematic to use.
exactly.
Right? Like we could talk about ROI. You've thought about it the exact right way, but I think one of the things that did stick out is you had happy customers.
Right.
You had customers who were happy being able to use the product because it added value. And so, that's important. The moment you have, so one is the maintenance overhead, right? You just think about that. It's not just about bug reduction. It's actually about general maintenance and monitoring and how much time you'll be able to spend on that. Second, I actually think the other ROI is, you being able to do an internal CSAT and being able to see what those look like. And then, then there's going to be more tactical things as you think about improving in code branches and being able to think about how you're able to take feature requests, how you're able to basically do this, how quickly the throughput is typically. So that ultimately is something how you basically measure value. I think one of the things that are important in this, and I think people need to take away, is if you have been working in an engineering organization or been managing technical teams, it's really hard to be able to articulate that. When you go to a finance team or you go to, being able to speak to the business and be able to say, well, look, here's what we need to spend, here's what we're doing. That's actually really hard. So I think being able to build a tool, or at least be able to use a tool like this, which helps articulate that, that's important. I think the next version of this, when we hopefully do this again, you'll have me on board again, is to be able to go a few layers deep. Because if you think about all the transformations that are happening with AI, the level of data pipelines that you need to manage, all of the ingest that you need to be able to do, that also basically adds. So I think this is a great baseline to be able to put into place, and helps to be able to sort of go to the next level. And each of them are quantifiable. That's the other thing.
Exactly, yeah. It's great to see that value from customers, but developer happiness, I agree. Maybe we'll add like a smiley face here that is measuring that. Yeah. Okay, so in the essence of time, I will jump to the demo, and I will try to make it in 7 minutes, and we'll then leave time for questions and answers. So I hope that you still see my screen in a good way. So this is Wiremark Cloud, and obviously there is a lot to show. I will focus on one use case today. And what we see here in Wiremark Cloud, this is the UI where you see the list of all the mocks. Each of these mock represent an endpoint. By the way, we have a lot of customers that are starting with the open source and moving to the cloud, and one of the motivation is that you don't have any UI and the open source, and now you have like thousands of mocks that they kind of dispersed about around the organization. So you need to manage that in a central way. So this allows you to do that in a very easy way. And the flow that we will talk about it today is actually how do you improve parallel development beginning to start from the prototype process. So what we talked about, the ability to design the API using a mock, we call it mock-based API prototype. So what I will do, I will create new mock API. I will choose a type of open API. And when we create that, let's say we are a payment company and you want to create a charges API. Or let's do charges one, okay? Basically, what you will see here is this is the mock. We have an endpoint that we can actually call. So instead of calling the real API, we will call the mock API, the mock URL, and this will serve the request with the response. And if we create a stub, basically each stub represents like kind of a use case that we will have. One thing that I forgot to show is that we have an Open API tab here that this will represent the Open API that will be generated. Right now it's empty and doesn't have anything interesting. So if we go back to the tab and we'll create a new one, and let's say we want to create a charges API, okay, and we will do a post to charge, okay, and now let's see if I'm able to do that. Sorry, I think we did something wrong here. Second. One second. This is what happened when you try to do a demo on a webinar. So
it's going to happen to all of us eventually, Erie. You know that.
But yeah.
This is what we refer to as live error handling, and you're doing it. You're pulling it off really well. So kudos to you.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll share that. Let me know if you see that now. And basically what we see here, this is the match area where we actually define how a request will be matched. And you can see that there are a lot of ways to match. First of all, we are saying that we want the request to be matched by a post message to charge. And we have different ways to match. Here we will choose body match. And what we will say, we want to match this request if we will get this actual data in the body, okay? And then in the response, and now we will need to copy again and hope that this time it will be better, yeah. So now it works easier. So in the response, we will just say, okay, we submitted the charge and this is the response. And now we will press save. Okay, sorry. Now we will press the save, and we have the stub created, and we have this nice test request here that actually enable you to test stuff while you are designing. So you see how quick and easy it is to do stuff. So I can send the request and I will see that this stub was matched, and now I'm getting the response. So this is kind of the definition of creating a mock. But the nice and interesting part here that while I was doing that, WireMock actually generated the OpenAPI spec for me. So you see that the OpenAPI spec was generated, and now if I'm going in addition to the OpenAPI spec, we actually generated public API documentation, which enable you to see like the documentation of the API. You can see the request and the response. You can send API requests that are connected to the mock in order to see like how things will behave. So the idea is that you started with the mock, but you generated actually at the end of this session you generated both OpenAPI spec as well as this documentation portal and the mock server that enable everything to be developed in parallel and to keep sync in sync. I will just mention that one problem that a lot of time people will talk about is what they call mock drift. So they will have a challenge and we'll talk about the fact that, okay, I designed the API or I designed the mock, but then someone went and changed something. So we have an ability to activate validation, and the validation will actually alert you when something changed. So if someone now went and changed something with the mock, we will get a validation error, and that way we will enable teams to keep in sync. I will try to do that in 1 second. So basically, let's say I am now the mobile team, and I want to clone this. I want to clone this mock. Okay, and when I clone that, I actually decided for some reason to remove that part. So I removed that, and now I'm calling the mock. But now what will happen, like you said, is that the mock actually failed because it says there is an OpenAI schema validation error, and that way you will keep sync in sync. You can also go to our request log and see in the request log the actual error, kind of a debugger that is showing you the specific problem and saying currency is missing but is required. So with that quick demo, you can see how we were able to very quickly and very dynamically do a design session, generate the examples that are represented by the mock, but that also generated for you artifact that you will stay with, in the sense of the documentation portal, the OpenAI spec, validations that enable you to avoid the mock drift, and really improve developer productivity across the board. So that went well, beside the share screen problem at the beginning. So I hope that was clear. And we'll go now to questions and answer. I will just say that, we'll be glad to connect with everyone. We have in our cloud edition, free forever WireMock cloud account. So we have the open source, but also in our WireMock cloud platform, we have a free forever edition. You can also join WireMock live sessions. You can connect with us through the website, follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn. We also have a Slack channel that is very active. So there are a lot of different ways to connect with us. We'll let now go to the part of questions and answers.
All right, perfect. Well, Yuri and Yusuf, we've received a couple of questions, but before we dive in, I do just want to remind everyone to please check out that handout section. There are a whole bunch of resources there for you, so feel free to click on all of those, save those for later, check those out. All right, team, our first question comes in from Lynn. I'll go ahead and pop it up on the screen. Can you discuss some of the tools and technologies available to developers for streamlining API usage and improving productivity?
So like I said, there are a lot of different tools in this space. There is a conference that is sponsored, and they have the API map, and you see different tools around API observability and API usage and API documentation. So there are a lot of different tools, and you have API gateway, and it's a very complex environment. And I would say that all tools are good in the space that they are, and some tools are generating trying to generate full API management platform. Like I showed, what we are trying to do with WireMock is taking the use of the mocking and enable really better productivity with the use of this technology by simplifying complex processes that are the result of a dependency on APIs. Yusuf, something to add?
No, I think you covered it. This industry has grown rapidly, so there are a ton of tools out there. The one piece of advice I would give is you have to select the tool. It sounds basic. I know I'm not trying to reduce the kind of importance of it, but you have to do your homework for being able to put in a solution on two vectors. Number one, is it right for the use case that you have? Lots of opportunities, lots of brands, and all the other stuff, but is it the right solution for you? And the second is, who's building this out a product that it will become a platform. I think the journey that kind of Wiremark has gone through, being able to think about the developer experience at large, I think, there are a number of solutions out there to be able to do that. Like, that has to be the core focus. And when you don't get that, that tool is probably not the right thing for you, because just remember, talked about the overload of like the work that has to be going into place. Developers and engineering functions do not have time to constantly think about switching all the time. As nice as it sounds, like I have the optionality, you need to have something which has a much more holistic approach. So that's kind of important to have.
Thanks for that, Yusuf. Let's dive right into question number 2. What can you tell us about API versioning and how you deal with APIs that often change within a program?
Yeah, so in terms of, I will start maybe with the second question of how do you deal with API that often change within a program? So this is definitely something that we see in from customers, and the way that we solve is what I showed with the validation. So basically, the validation is a way to get alerted when you get changes in an API. In addition to that, we have an ability to update the mock when API is changing, when OpenAPI is changing, or like we showed, it's kind of, we call it a OpenAPI spec 360 round trip. So we have an ability to also update the OpenAPI spec if the mock changes. And we are planning to add a recording-based update that will enable you to run a recording session that will record the real API, and that will actually update the mock based on that. So this is kind of covering these changes. And API versioning and mock API versioning, we actually solve through an integration with Git. So we have an integration with Git where our customers will manage the versioning in Git itself.
The only thing I would add is basically think about the complexity that come in with the nature of your business when it comes to things like data residency, regulations, and security and otherwise. People sometimes completely overlook that. Being able to think about having the right versioning in place when you think about where you're not just pulling data from, but what you're actually accessing, what you're transferring, like that has to be compliant. And it's kind of overlooked. And the only way to be able to do that is to be able to do sort of rigorous testing around that. So one of the things that typically get missed on versioning is being able to actually put that in control.
Cody, I think you're on mute for some reason.
Yes, thank you. We've got time for one more question, so let's dive right into it. Raymond asks, do you have any examples where you can use the tooling for security testing?
We do. It's a use case that we see. We see a lot of. First of all, we have Auth0 integration, which it's a very complex thing to do, and we actually have a mock template for that, where you're able to test your application by simulating Auth0 workflows. Which is something that is challenging, and we see a challenge for a lot of customers. So this is quite popular template. And there are also other security use cases that we are seeing. We will also, a lot of stuff is driven by how our customers are using the platform, because eventually it's a platform. And we will see a lot of customers talking, or a lot of users, either of the open source or the cloud, talking about how they use Wiremark for security testing and simulating like different security flows.
All right. Well, that does bring us to the top of the hour. I know we received just a couple more questions that we won't have time to get to, but we will be sure to make sure that these questions make their way to the Wiremark team, and they can follow up with you afterwards.
Cool.
Yuri and Yusuf, thank you so much for joining us today on Techstrong Learning. It's been such a pleasure hearing from you over the past hour.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great to see you, Yuri. Thank you.
Bye.
So before I release our audience, just a couple of last minute things. Today's session was recorded, and we will be sending you the recording via email here shortly. You can also find it living on the DevOps website. Just visit devops.com/webinars. I will be contacting 2 of our most engaged attendees to give them $50 Amazon gift card. So thank you for your chats and your questions, but you can still become eligible by filling out our survey. It is pinned to the top of the chat as well as in the handouts. I'll also point out that Monica posted in the chat a link to the Get Started with Free Sign Up link. Do click that while you're here with us. You don't want to miss out on that opportunity. I'd like to thank WireMock for sponsoring our program today. And to everyone here, thank you so much for joining. We appreciate you spending your time here with us at Techstrong Learning, and we hope to see you at a future learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Thanks again, team.
Thank you.